Halo was the biggest shooter game in the world, and then with the blink of an eye, it was the most forgettable. What the heck happened? It's not really a question of what happened. It's more like what didn't happen. You had business people with no knowledge of game development, and game developers with no knowledge of business. This is the story of how Halo died, and how we killed it. First, let's talk about Halo's competition. This is GoldenEye, a retro gaming classic. It was a James Bond FPS game on the Nintendo 64. And the reason I'm showing it to you is to show you how weird FPS games were decades ago. See how the player stops moving to precisely aim? That's because the Nintendo 64 controller only had one analog stick. Now, if you've ever played a console shooter in your life, you can probably see the problem. Halo fixed that problem. After an Apple press conference where the prototype for Halo was revealed as a generic RTS game for the Mac, Bill Gates swooped in to recruit the developers at Bungie to spearhead their new gaming console from Microsoft, meant to compete with Sony's PlayStation, the Xbox. Halo Combat Evolved, released in 2001. It was an instant hit, and you could move and shoot at the same time. Nobody had done that yet. Sure, Halo was an action-packed science fiction adventure set on a strange ring-shaped world where daring Marines fought against cunning alien armies. It was certainly that, but more importantly, you could move and shoot. That was big for console FPS games. Halo's core gameplay loop was also very good, and it didn't offer one thing for one type of person. It offered something for everyone, casual or competitive. It offered a variety of gameplay experiences, like the wide, sweeping, vehicle-laden vistas of Blood Gulch to the tight arena shooter action of Chill Out. It could handle this breadth of gunfighting distances, time to kill, and other balancing factors thanks to a novel, shield recharging system. It was also a bit slower than other more well-known arena shooters on the PC like Quake, and it kind of had to be that way. You couldn't do crazy flicks and rocket jump techs through map terrain like this. It was just not gonna happen with two analog sticks. And then strangely enough, many years later, this slow simplicity would be replaced to, well, you'll see. For now, the gameplay was good in the multiplayer, but the single-player story was truly something special too. Bungie was really good at making single-player levels. A really good example of this was the Truth and Reconciliation level. That looming construct in the sky is an alien warship, and Bungie wanted that warship to feel ominous, awe-inspiring. Humanity was at odds with its most dangerous adversary yet. It was a religious nation-state comprised of various alien races, all engaged in a holy mission to activate an ancient power that lurks below the surface of the strange world you find yourself on. Little did anybody know, we'd never have a single-player campaign quite like this one again. For Bungie, it wasn't enough for the mechanics of shooting aliens to be fun. The actual game had to be an immersive, cinematic experience. It wasn't just one level. Every level of Halo was this vast, epic action-adventure set piece with an involved theatrical orchestra soundtrack, believable and energetic voice acting,
Pulse has a maximum effective radius of 25,000 light years.
and a world that felt alive and real. Halo was more than just a fun game. It was an immersive and compelling creative experience. Until it wasn't. Other things Halo popularized, like the console LAN party, split-screen multiplayer, and the co-op campaign, would eventually become things that modern Halo games would put on the back burner or cut altogether. But nobody knew this at the time. At the time, it felt like we were on the verge of the next big shooter game, because we were.
It's finished.
No, I think we're just getting started.
A few years would go by, and Bungie would follow up their success with a sequel, Halo 2. Halo 2 leaned on an action-packed narrative experience, showing the perspective of the Alien Covenant faction in better detail, but its longevity would be established by a brand new gaming phenomenon, Xbox Live.
You are proper cheating. Quickscoping is cheating to start with, but the way you are quickscoping, that is way too quick. Reported.
Halo's single-player campaign was what got people hooked, but its multiplayer is what made people stay. Halo 2 was noteworthy for adding dual-wielding and vehicle hijacking to the Halo formula, but these were just garnishes compared to what made Halo a mainstream phenomenon. Halo 2 was one of the first multiplayer games to offer a ranked ladder system, which gave players an incentive to grind and learn the game at an intimate level. And before there were esports orgs, we had the birth of Halo clans. Yeah, I know, sounds lame, but we had FaZe Clan, so it was cool. If you were a noob, you probably got clipped in a funny Halo 3 machine cinema. Again, I know, we were 12. A few years later, Halo 3 cemented the Xbox 360 as a gaming powerhouse, with a hugely anticipated release and GameStops all across the country jam-packed at midnight. Back then, the graphical difference between the original Xbox and the brand new Xbox was a truly special moment, and Halo 3 still holds up to this day graphically. Every kid in this line had no idea this was the last moment they'd ever have like this. Halo was easy money. It had fantastic single-player story mode gameplay and addictive multiplayer. But now, Halo 3 had something other games couldn't make: culture. Halo 3 added the widely praised Forge and Theater modes. In Forge, players could edit maps and make their own interpretations of how the gameplay should pan out with different weapons and vehicle spawns and wacky creative touches. One day, Forge would graduate from being a map editor to a fully detailed map creator. Theater mode was as robust as you could get for console gaming, where players could watch their gameplay with a versatile camera system. Halo was a culture. Halo was a community. And that was something executives couldn't replicate on a spreadsheet. You had fan-made cinematic series that would go on to become big media conglomerates like Rooster Teeth. The devs would run the so-called Bungie's Workshop, showcasing their favorite community creations of maps, screenshots, and more. It felt like a shared space, a shared moment in the gaming landscape, and then it started to change rapidly. Maybe a little too rapidly. 3 years later, Bungie wrote their swan song for the Halo franchise, a game that cut no corners on the emotionally tragic consequences of war and service, Halo Reach. It depicted the deadliest battle in the Human Covenant War, the one that kick-started it all, and the one that ended in a resounding, overwhelming loss for the good guys. And Master Chief wasn't a playable character this time. In Halo Reach, everybody died. Everyone. And maybe so did Bungie's passion. Not with this game specifically, but for any future Halo games at all. Halo Reach had everything you wanted out of a Halo game. Theater, Forge, the iconic gameplay loop, but Bungie wanted to experiment with the formula. Reach added armor abilities, basically giving each player a unique thing they could do once in a little while. You had relatively tame abilities like a hologram you could use to deceive enemies, a jetpack, a shield, which didn't seem that different from the bubble shield in the previous game, so whatever. But this mechanic brought armor lock, and even one more controversial topic to the formula, and that was sprint. Wait, what? Are you serious? This is more controversial than this? Yeah, it's complicated. So let's just approach it logically. Without sprint, going from one end of the map to the other one takes longer. With sprint, you can do that faster. But in the context of an arena shooter, sprint ends up becoming a lot more powerful than you might think. It means getting the sniper rifle before anybody else. It means faster rotations and cutoffs to keep somebody from capturing the objective. It means getting away from engagements that would otherwise kill you. It means better timings and better positioning. But more people seem to be concerned about armor lock, wherein a player could overcharge their shields into an invulnerable, immovable state for a brief period of time, because it was a lot more frustrating and in your face to lose a 1v1 because somebody spammed the ability key and broke your shields. Armor lock had counterplay. Yeah, you could throw grenades at their feet before the timer went up, but for every disadvantage to armor lock, there was another advantage. You had a brief quarter second of invulnerability after exiting armor lock for some reason, which meant if you wanted to go for a melee, you had to hit the timing on their exit just right, and they could exit whenever they wanted. If you want to melee them early, you get stunned. Plus, when they get out of the armor lock, they'd knock your shields, and they recharged their shields in the armor lock. Like, it was a fun pub mechanic. You could wreck enemy warthogs trying to run you over, but it wasn't competitively sound. In terms of competitive play, the only armor abilities that made it into the MLG rule set were evade and jetpack. No sprint, no armor lock. That was fine. Halo had a modular design that could be for anybody, right? You would think, but Bungie might have set themselves up for failure with this idea. This is the battle rifle. You've probably seen it even if you haven't played a Halo game. It's just that iconic, down to the scope and the carry handle, and its almost sci-fi, real-life military fusion aesthetic. And its burst fire mechanic just meshed really well with the shield design of Halo. Halo Reach replaced this weapon with the single-shot DMR, which was fine, but to incentivize precise shot placement and to disincentivize spamming the trigger at long range, Bungie added a blooming effect to the weapon as it fired, with a circle that would gradually loosen and provide a large, randomized radius of shots rather than a tight aiming point. PC sweats know this mechanic as spread. And in middle school, I couldn't have told you what this was, but it was uncharacteristic of any Halo game that had existed previously. Now, granted, Halo didn't have precise AK-47 from Counter-Strike levels of precision, but it was still more precise than this. In Halo 3, if you could hit your shots from a long distance, you were good for it. Skill issue, man. Win your ones. But in Halo Reach, you had to be a bit more conscientious on paper, not in practice, because most players just spammed the trigger anyway, which was the opposite of what Bungie wanted them them to do. Basically, every precision gunfight you would have had in Halo 3 turned into a roulette wheel in Halo Reach. This topic was intensely argued for years. Accusations of noob, nowadays a rather vulgar insult, were thrown around left and right on both sides of the argument, and it seemed like the conversation was going nowhere, prompting Bungie to get off the couch and step in with a response. To address the issue on their end, they stopped making Halo. Wait, what? It's safe to say that there might have been some reasons Reach was such a controversial period for the game's development history. By now, reports had come out about Bungie's relationship with Microsoft, and the details didn't paint a pretty picture. Bungie had been under the gun with Halo 2 to get it working for the brand new Xbox Live service, and they experienced multiple periods of intense crunch time and significant stress. Features often had to be scaled back or cut altogether to meet the timeline Microsoft set. Halo 2 did so well that it ironically put Bungie in an even more stressful position with Halo 3 because they had become the Xbox's biggest selling point. Xbox lived or died by Bungie's hand, and Microsoft took advantage of that, continually positioning Bungie with constrained and claustrophobic development windows, as well as expectations for franchising. Some attempts had been made and they went well. After all, Bungie's offshoot PvE-focused game, Halo 3 ODST, was received tremendously well, and Halo Wars, developed by Ensemble Studios, had realized the full vision of the license as an RTS game, proving once again that Halo could make gameplay experiences, primarily based on the PC, work well on consoles. Microsoft wanted more and more Halo, but Bungie just couldn't deliver. Or maybe they just didn't want to. Not only that, looking back on Halo Reach, it seems reflective of the mood inside the building. A game that was so dark and tragic in its narrative component, it almost seemed like a deliberate attempt to say, we're done with this. Microsoft wouldn't have it that way, but it's not like they didn't plan ahead. Halo 3 and Halo Reach were actually a part of a plan that was a long time coming. Bungie told Microsoft, we got 2 more games in us, and we're done. So back in 2007, Microsoft created 343 Industries, a studio that would handle the development of everything Halo after Bungie's departure. They served a supplementary role until 2012 when they decided to release their own entry into the franchise, Halo 4. The results were, well, it depends on who you talk to. It certainly was a Halo game, but it felt very different than Bungie Halo. For one, the art style looked very different. Spartan suits looked a lot more slender and less space tactical, more like a Warframe design, which wasn't bad, but it wasn't really Halo. It was clear the game was under new management. Critics of the story pointed out that it felt like 343 was jumping the shark with the writing, creating a whole new category of Spartans that were lifted from normal infantry, rather than the more sinister tone of the original Spartans and their origin point as captive child soldiers. But what got more flack than anything was the multiplayer. Halo 4 was the first Halo game to make sprint a main part of the gameplay design for every individual player rather than an ability. Now, as we talked about previously, the game had issues balancing around sprint in the past for all those reasons. But one thing that doesn't get talked about is that the introduction of sprint to the formula meant that the pacing and the flow of the maps had to be changed to accommodate rapid movement, making them longer and more drawn out. And that meant you couldn't copy-paste previously existing fan favorites to this game. A lot of people described Halo 4 as a Call of Duty clone with shields, and those complaints weren't gonna stop. By the time Halo 5 came out in 2015, things were getting really bad. Halo 5 had totally jumped the shark with its single-player narrative, and the fan-favorite character of Cortana being relegated to the role of a villain, and its theatrics had departed considerably from the moody, somber, hard military sci-fi vibes of the previous games. Nothing better exemplifies this departure than the opening sequence for Halo 5, which seemed to be a direct copy of the energy and mood captured by the Marvel movies of the time, with the Spartans depicted as agile, acrobatic, dancing figures rather than insanely fast and hard-hitting machine people at the knife edge of life and death. Tonally, something was just off. It had Halo words and Halo things in it, but it didn't really feel like Halo. And some would claim that not only did the game not feel like Halo artistically, but that it didn't feel like Halo mechanically. Halo 5 tried really hard to inject new life into the formula, but for all the reasons that things like sprint and armor lock and weapon spread were contentious topics in previous games, this time it was even more controversial. Halo 5 had a lot more movement tech for the Spartan suits. You could charge and slam into people, you could dash in any direction, you could slide, you could clamber over obstacles. All of these things were bad, apparently. I guess. The main counter arguments were essentially that the old gameplay formula was iconic and didn't need changing, just polish. Halo was not supposed to have complex movement techs, but this caused a big rift in the community. Now, Halo always had a dedicated esports scene, and the game was often praised by influencers like Summit1G for its fresh take, but lots of Halo fans violently disagree. Maybe it would have done relatively okay if it hadn't been for an infamous marketing video Microsoft had put together that seemed to belittle players for taking issues with the game's convoluted microtransaction system.
Wait, won't rec packs with special weapons break the exquisitely refined balance of arena multiplayer? Secure your noise hole, soldier. Grown-ups are talking.
Damn it.
Anyway, from this point forward, Halo would go into radio silence. The game's emphasis on a more competitive approach was often cited as what did the game in, but I think there's a little bit more to it than that. After what seemed like an eternity, 343 released a new Halo game in 2021. It was the biggest Halo launch of all time, and I'm not making that up. Halo Infinite had a ton of pre-launch hype. Players loved the return to form for its art style with what appeared to be a more grounded, hard sci-fi sort of vibe. The gameplay was the closest the formula had ever gotten to the original games. Sprint was still around, but it wasn't front and center, and any crazy movement abilities have been thrown to the wayside in favor of simple, well-known gunplay. Fan-favorite weapons made appearances, alongside some interesting new ones, and then it bombed. Basically, Halo Infinite was met with a wide range of development challenges that culminated in consistent delays. One frustrating component was the way armor and colors were handled. Armor colors were allocated to shader systems, kind of like Destiny, so you couldn't just pick any color you wanted, and armor pieces were often allocated to battle passes rather than dedicated in-game challenges. The battle passes could be finished whenever you wanted, so that reduced the FOMO aspect of not finishing the pass in time, but they were criticized heavily for their grinding nature. Now, all of that couldn't make up for the fact that the game released in 2021 without a robust live service content model. Halo had its single-player campaign released for full price, while the multiplayer was offered as free-to-play. The pricing model was a first in Halo's lifespan, but many felt like this was just an excuse to get away with not providing certain key features at launch. Halo Infinite arrived without the Forge mode or a cooperative campaign. Halo Infinite's content seemed to be slow-dripped, with its first Ghosts of Reach season lasting 6 months, as opposed to the conventional 3 months. This prompted players to point out a content drought. 343 eventually had to ramp up the tempo, but at this point, the game had lost its momentum in the public space. Halo Infinite is one of the lowest rated games on Twitch Tracker, with 3,000 concurrent viewers across the whole website on a good day. But what does get some viewership at all is HCS, Halo Infinite's esports component. Nowadays, HCS is a lot like MLG as it was many years ago. It partitions off certain parts of the Halo sandbox that aren't as suited to competitive play, which this sort of vibe has been around for a long time. If you don't want to play sweaty Halo, you can play non-sweaty Halo. It's as simple as hitting another button. Just kidding. HCS might be the most hated esports component, at least in terms of its popularity, compared to the general audience of the game it's based off of. Professional Halo players are often blamed for the game not doing well. They're the subject of ridicule, memes, angry retorts. They're essentially just blamed for scaring the normal people away. But Halo had a professional scene before, and nobody had an issue. Halo was responsible for fostering a really active, grassroots level console FPS esports scene. Today, Halo players can still play Halo any way they want. Its modular nature is still often cited as what makes it work so well. And nowadays, Halo content online almost always has a negative slant to it. Whether it's more on-the-nose arguments about the culture war, accusations leveled at the devs regarding laziness or lack of effort, or just general distaste with the gaming industry in general. And so, we get back to the point of the video. What really killed Halo? Halo's development history is a history of contentious development cycles and bitter arguments between devs and corporate, as well as how do you market this thing to the general public. At one point, Halo was supposed to be for everybody, but as it turns out, pleasing everybody is very hard to do, especially in the algorithmic entertainment age. Today, people often cite the golden age of the series either around Halo 2 or Halo 3, and that's when the game was its most simple, content or otherwise. Halo 3 had map packs, yeah, but back then the value of the price point was often heavily debated, and as far back as 2008, map packs were controversial microtransaction arguments. Halo 3, whether people know it or not, didn't have nearly as many armor pieces as Halo Infinite, and Forge wasn't nearly as easy to use. So if it's not features, if it's not content, and it's not design, what was it? Was it Sprint? Was Sprint really the glue? I think it's more complicated than that. The truth is, Halo was lightning in a bottle. It arrived at the perfect place and at the perfect time, and it was cool. Master Chief and Cortana's unorthodox, subtly hinted at love story was cool. Sergeant Johnson's one-liners were cool.
Oh, I know what the ladies like.
Navigating the streets of moonlit New Mombasa was cool. The cosmic horror of the Flood, combined with the world-shattering terror of the Covenant, was cool. Halo, more than Sprint or esports or whatever, was just cool. It was a staple of nerd culture.
It's Halo night.
And I think that losing sight of that is where it really started to go wrong, not esports. What often doesn't get talked about with the destructive nature of Halo 5's trust in the property was that the single-player campaign was widely panned. The creative people at Bungie were clearly long gone, and adapting a license with a whole new group of people is hard. But perhaps more importantly, it was difficult to get a beat of what audience members wanted. A report came out relatively recently detailing how the developers at 343 had all sorts of ideas for adaptations of the Halo license that could have gotten around the whole should we add sprint or not argument, like an ODST-themed Helldivers sort of co-op shoot-'em-up game. And Halo Wars obviously proved that Halo license could work in a different medium than the typical FPS formula we were all used to, because the lore of this world was so expansive. I think what really happened to Halo was that the core audience got old, and Halo got old. Instead of trying to scale the license into different ways that different audiences could enjoy to let it really become a pop culture staple, the developers argued with the community about Sprint for 10 years straight. Most people don't argue about Sprint. Go outside to your street right now and ask them about their opinion on Halo Sprint. You are watching this video and I'm making a commentary because we're plugged into the scene, but most people don't talk about this stuff. Halo had mainstream appeal, and in order to have mainstream appeal, you have to look at the bigger picture. The community never seemed to be able to make up their mind. It's Bungie's fault, it's 343's fault, it's Microsoft's fault. As of recording this video, it's reported that Halo is currently profitable, and that the 343 guys are working on a new project within the Halo universe. So maybe Halo didn't die. After all, the servers are still online, just like Spartans never die. Halo might be a tragic case study in franchise bloat, in getting too close to the franchising sun and not quitting while you're ahead. But there's one thing that successful multimedia franchises in the nerd culture space like 40K and Star Wars have taught me. Creative visions cannot last solely on fan service, well received or otherwise. Successful franchises like Halo need talented people working on them and letting them cook. So maybe 343's cooking right now. We'll just have to wait and see.